Welcome to Random Hacking Video Channel. Today, we will learn about a vulnerability in the AWS Instance Metadata Service and how to easily fix it. For this, we will be using an EC2 instance vulnerable to IMDS v1. On the screen, you see a random URL. Let's see what response we get when we hit this URL using curl. We see some more random text returned as part of the response, which looks like some sort of endpoints or API routes that resemble properties or metadata of an EC2 instance. But before exploring further, let's jump into the AWS documentation and learn about the IMDS service first. According to the AWS guide, instance metadata is data about your instance that you can use to configure or manage the running instance. This service is also useful when a running program needs information about the instance for various purposes. The metadata is retrieved from a fixed AWS IP address that is only accessible from an EC2 operating system environment and cannot be accessed from systems outside AWS. Instance metadata is organized into categories. To retrieve instance metadata, you specify the category in your request, and the corresponding metadata is returned in the response. Let's get back to the demo and see what else we can retrieve. Starting with the base path/latest, which also represents the version of the API endpoint, we then have /metadata. Under this, there is an interesting path known as /im. Let's find out what subpaths and endpoints it may have under it, along with the data we will be able to retrieve. As we explore further into the path, we see a role name that resembles an instance profile of this EC2 instance. To allow an EC2 instance to interact with other AWS resources, we attach a role to the EC2 instance with the necessary permissions. This is accomplished via an instance profile. If we further query this role, we obtain the temporary API credentials associated with it. This is useful in many cases, but imagine if these API credentials are stolen. This could potentially lead to an AWS account compromise, depending on the permissions granted to the EC2 role. Credential stealers often use server-side request forgery attacks to steal these credentials. SSRF is a web security vulnerability that allows attackers to make the server-side application send requests to unintended locations. In an SSRF attack, the server might connect to internal services or arbitrary external systems, potentially leaking sensitive data like authorization credentials. In the case of IMDS, if the EC2 launch configuration allows version 1 of IMDS calls and exposes a web service vulnerable to SSRF, attackers can easily gain access to the account via the EC2 role's STS credentials. To prevent this exploitation, upgrading to IMDS v2 can be effective. IMDS v2 prevents direct calls to the IMDS v2 API and requires the generation of a temporary token first. This token must be generated from /latest/API/token. Let's generate a token and examine its contents. Upon printing the token, it appears to be in base64 format. Upon further decoding, it seems there is an encrypted payload, which appears to be difficult to understand. This encrypted payload likely contains the necessary authentication and authorization information required to access IMDS v2 resources securely. So now, when we pass the token as a header to retrieve those temporary credentials, it does work. Next, let's take a look at how to disable IMDS v1 and enforce only IMDS v2. In the AWS EC2 console page of the already shutdown instance, navigate to Actions, Instance Settings, and click on Modify Instance Metadata option. Inside the pop-up, change IMDS v2 optional to Required. Click Save. Let's start the EC2 instance and see if we are still able to make IMDS v1 calls. And voila! We are no longer able to make direct calls to IMDS. Now, we can only make calls using tokens. We have now learned how to make it harder for any attacker to break into our AWS account.